Let your shoulders sink deeper into whatever surface holds you now. Feel the weight of your body settling, as if you were slowly melting into the soft moss of an ancient forest floor. Notice how your breathing naturally slows, matching the unhurried rhythm of distant waves against primordial shores. The air around you carries the faint scent of wood smoke and the gentle whisper of leaves that have been rustling for millennia, utterly unbothered by the passage of time. Our story today begins in an era so magnificently inefficient that it makes your last Zoom meeting look like a masterclass in productivity. Picture, if your increasingly drowsy mind can manage it, a time roughly 100,000 years ago when the most sophisticated form of human communication involved a series of grunts that would make a modern-day conference call seem like Shakespeare performing at the Globe Theatre. The scene opens on a particularly unremarkable morning in what would someday become known as the Fertile Crescent, though at this point it was just dirt with aspirations. The sun crept over the horizon with all the enthusiasm of someone attending their third consecutive status update meeting, casting long shadows across a landscape dotted with small clusters of early humans who had mastered the art of looking busy while accomplishing absolutely nothing. Our protagonists, and I use that term with the loosest possible interpretation, were gathered around what archaeologists would later dignify with the term hearth, but which was really just a pile of rocks that someone had optimistically arranged in a circle. The fire crackled with the lazy contentment of flames that knew they had nowhere else to be, sending wisps of smoke curling upward into air so clean it would give a modern environmentalist heart palpitations. Grok, for that was not his name, but rather the sound he made when trying to clear his throat, squatted on his haunches and surveyed his fellow early humans with the weary expression of someone who had just realized this meeting could have been an email. If emails had existed, which they didn't, because writing wouldn't be invented for another several dozen millennia. And even then, it would take humans approximately 40,000 years to figure out how to complain about it properly. The group had assembled for what modern anthropologists would grandly term a gathering to establish basic communicative protocols, but which was really just 7 barely evolved primates trying to agree on what sound meant food versus large predator approaching versus I need to relieve myself behind that bush. The subtle distinctions between these concepts had already led to several unfortunate misunderstandings, including one memorable incident where Throk had enthusiastically responded to what he thought was a dinner invitation, only to find himself face to face with a saber-toothed tiger that was equally confused about the social protocols of the situation. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a comfortable blanket, muffling the distant calls of birds who had already figured out more sophisticated communication systems than the assembled humans but were far too polite to mention it. A gentle breeze stirred the grass with the patience of wind that had been practicing the same movement for geological ages, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the faint promise of rain that might arrive sometime in the next season or two. Grok cleared his throat, that distinctive grok sound that would eventually become his identifier, and prepared to address the group. This process took approximately 47 minutes, as early humans had not yet discovered the concept of getting to the point. He began with what could generously be called an opening statement, which consisted of pointing at the sun, grunting twice, scratching himself, and then staring meaningfully at each member of the group for intervals that would make modern eye contact seem hurried. The first item on their unwritten agenda, for obvious reasons, concerned the critical distinction between the grunt that meant mammoth and the grunt that meant run for your life. There's a mammoth coming to kill us all. This had become something of a pressing issue after last week's incident, when Unk had excitedly alerted the group to what he believed was a nearby mammoth ready for hunting, leading to a 3-hour armed expedition that ended with the disappointing discovery of a particularly large rock that Unk had mistaken for a mammoth in the early morning light. The rock, for its part, remained diplomatically silent throughout the subsequent discussion about improving communication protocols, though several group members could have sworn it looked vaguely apologetic about the whole misunderstanding. Mech, who served as the group's closest approximation to a voice of reason, had prepared for this meeting by spending the previous evening practicing various vocal inflections of the grunt in question. She had discovered that a rising intonation suggested excitement about mammoth hunting opportunities, while a sharp, urgent bark indicated immediate mammoth-related danger. The subtle difference between these two variations was roughly equivalent to the difference between "Would you like some tea?" and "The building is on fire," which explains why early human society was characterized by a remarkable number of entirely avoidable catastrophes. The cave behind them dripped with the steady patience of water that had been following the same path for centuries, each drop contributing to the slow formation of stalactites that would someday puzzle future archaeologists. The sound created a natural rhythm, like a metronome set to the tempo of geological time, providing the perfect soundtrack for discussions that moved at roughly the same pace as continental drift. The discussion proceeded with all the efficiency of erosion. Bog, whose contribution to early human society was primarily limited to his ability to find the muddiest possible spot to sit in any given location, raised what he clearly considered to be a pertinent point. He gestured towards the horizon with a series of arm movements that resembled someone attempting to direct traffic while simultaneously swatting at invisible flies, accompanying this interpretive dance with a sequence of sounds that fell somewhere between a cat coughing up a hairball and a wooden cart with squeaky wheels. The group regarded this communication attempt with the polite attention typically reserved for someone explaining their cryptocurrency investment strategy. Several minutes of thoughtful head-scratching ensued, during which the fire continued its patient crackling and a nearby stream murmured to itself in the ancient language of water over stones, a conversation that had been ongoing since long before humans had arrived to complicate matters with their ambitious vocal experiments. Who had appointed himself the group's unofficial record keeper despite the inconvenient absence of any actual records to keep, attempted to summarize Bog's contribution by repeating the gestures with slight variations, like a game of prehistoric telephone played entirely through interpretive movement. This resulted in what anthropologists would later term semantic drift, but which really just meant that by the time finished his interpretation, Bog's original message about needing to visit the bushes had somehow transformed into a complex military strategy involving flanking maneuvers against an enemy that may or may not have been a particularly aggressive shrub. The morning sun climbed higher with the leisurely pace of something that knew it had all day to reach its destination, warming the circle of proto-communicators who had now spent 2.5 hours attempting to establish the difference between mammoth and danger mammoth. The soft earth beneath them had been worn smooth by countless previous gatherings, creating natural seats that molded perfectly to bodies that spent most of their time either hunting, gathering, or engaging in discussions that made modern parliamentary procedure look like a model of swift decision-making. Throck, still somewhat embarrassed about the saber-toothed tiger incident, proposed what he clearly considered to be a revolutionary solution, using entirely different sounds for entirely different concepts. The group received this suggestion with the sort of stunned silence typically reserved for ideas so obviously brilliant that everyone wondered why no one had thought of them before. This was immediately followed by the crushing realization that implementing such a system would require them to actually remember which sound meant what, a cognitive challenge that made quantum physics seem like tic-tac-toe. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and the distant promise of weather that would eventually become someone else's problem. Somewhere in the forest, a bird called to its mate with a efficiency that would have made the assembled humans weep with envy if they had possessed the emotional vocabulary for such complex feelings. As it stood, their emotional range was roughly limited to hungry, sleepy, alert to potential danger, and confused about what everyone else is grunting about. Mick seized upon Throck's suggestion with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found a solution to a problem that had been keeping her awake at night, which, given that nighttime was when most mammoth-related emergencies seemed to occur, was literally the case. She proposed establishing what modern linguists would recognize as a basic phonemic system, though she expressed this concept through a series of demonstrations that involved making different sounds while pointing at various objects around their camp. This led to what could be charitably described as the world's first vocabulary lesson, and less charitably described as 45 minutes of grown adults pointing at rocks and making noises at each other like particularly ambitious toddlers. The process was complicated by the fact that several group members had different ideas about what sounds should correspond to what objects, leading to a heated debate that was conducted entirely through competing vocal demonstrations. The stream continued its ancient conversation with the stones, providing a soothing counterpoint to the increasingly animated discussion. Moss grew on the nearby trees with the patient determination of organisms that understood that all the good things in life took time, a philosophy that the early humans were inadvertently practicing, though they seemed considerably less zen about the whole process. Unk, eager to redeem himself after the rock mammoth confusion, volunteered to test the new system by attempting to communicate a simple concept. His desire for the group to share some of the berries that Grok had gathered earlier, this message, which should have been straightforward enough to convey through pointing and hopeful expressions, instead became a 20-minute performance piece that somehow conveyed his entire life story, his feelings about the weather, his opinion on the quality of the local water supply, and what appeared to be a detailed critique of Bog's posture. The berries, for their part, remained obliviously delicious while the group attempted to decode Unk's epic narrative. A butterfly landed briefly on Mech's shoulder, observed the proceedings with the detached interest of an insect that had evolved perfectly functional communication systems millions of years earlier, and then departed to attend to more pressing matters like finding flowers and avoiding being eaten by birds. Grok, meanwhile, had become distracted by the fascinating discovery that if he cupped his hands around his mouth, his voice made a slightly different sound. A breakthrough in acoustic engineering that would have revolutionized public speaking if public speaking had existed, or if there had been a public to speak to beyond this small circle of individuals who were still working on mastering the basics of making themselves understood to each other. The shadows grew shorter as the sun reached its zenith, casting dappled light through the canopy above like nature's own screensaver. The discovery of vocal acoustics led to what historians would generously call the cupping phase of early human linguistic development, during which every member of the group became convinced that slightly muffled grunting represented the pinnacle of communicative sophistication. For the next several hours, conversations took on the quality of people trying to speak through particularly thick fog, with the added challenge that no one was entirely certain what they were trying to say in the first place. A gentle afternoon breeze stirred the grass around their feet, carrying the sweet fragrance of wildflowers that had been blooming in cycles for millennia without requiring committee approval or lengthy discussions about their communication strategy. The earth beneath them radiated the absorbed warmth of the sun, creating a natural heating system that was both more reliable and more efficient than anything humans would manage to invent for the next several thousand years. Lek, who had been silently observing the proceedings while weaving grass stems into what would someday be recognized as humanity's first attempt at basket making, suddenly made a contribution that would revolutionize their entire approach to communication. She stood up, a process that took roughly 3 minutes, as early humans had not yet mastered the art of rapid movement, and began pointing at objects while making distinctly different sounds for each one. Rock, tree, water, fire, sky. The concept was so elegantly simple that it took the group approximately 2 hours to understand it. This was partly because Lek's pronunciation was somewhat unclear due to a berry seed stuck between her teeth, and partly because the group had become so accustomed to complicated interpretive communication that the idea of simply naming things seemed almost insultingly straightforward. Bog, still seated in what had now become a small muddy depression perfectly molded to his form, attempted to repeat Lek's demonstration. However, his version came out sounding like someone gargling with gravel while simultaneously being tickled, which led to a 20-minute sidebar discussion about whether he was trying to name objects or possibly choking on something. This confusion was eventually resolved when Bog pointed helpfully at his throat and made a series of gestures that indicated he was perfectly fine, just somewhat nasal due to seasonal allergies that wouldn't be properly understood for another 90,000 years. The late afternoon light slanted through the trees with the golden patience of illumination that had been practicing the same routine since the beginning of photosynthesis. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker established a steady rhythm against a dead tree, demonstrating the sort of consistent, purposeful communication that made the human effort seem rather ambitious by comparison. Grok, inspired by Lek's breakthrough, decided to expand the naming system to include actions. This led to the world's first charades game, though it was considerably less entertaining than future versions would be, mainly because the audience had no idea they were supposed to guess anything and kept offering helpful advice about Grok's apparent medical condition. When Grok attempted to demonstrate running by jogging slowly in place, the group became deeply concerned about his welfare and spent 45 minutes trying to convince him to sit down and rest. When he tried to indicate sleeping by lying down and closing his eyes, they assumed he had been overcome by some sort of sudden illness and began gathering medicinal herbs that probably wouldn't have helped with anything but made everyone feel useful. The process of establishing basic action words continued with the sort of determined inefficiency that would later characterize most human endeavors. Eating was successfully communicated after only 3 attempts, mainly because Grok had the foresight to actually consume something during his demonstration, which provided sufficient context for even the most linguistically challenged group members to grasp the concept. Drinking required more elaborate staging as it involved locating the communal water container, a hollowed gourd that had taken Throck approximately 6 months to perfect and of which he was unreasonably proud. The demonstration itself was successful, though it led to an unplanned intermission when everyone decided they were also thirsty, resulting in a ceremonial water-sharing ritual that took another hour and somehow evolved into a group discussion about the optimal size for water containers. The evening mist began to gather in the valley below, drifting between the trees like the breath of sleeping giants. The air grew cooler and carried the scent of evening flowers opening to greet the night-flying insects that had their own perfectly functional communication systems based on chemical signals and wing patterns. Elegant solutions that had never required a single committee meeting. Meg, emboldened by the day's progress, proposed what she clearly considered to be the logical next step, combining the naming words with the action words to create what modern linguists would recognize as basic sentence structure. She demonstrated this concept by pointing at Unk making the eating gesture and then pointing at the berry pile. The group stared at this innovation with the sort of profound bewilderment typically reserved for advanced calculus or instructions for assembling furniture. The idea that words could be combined to create more complex meanings was so revolutionary that it temporarily short-circuited their cognitive processes. Several group members began making random combinations of sounds and gestures, like people frantically pressing buttons on a device they didn't understand in hopes of accidentally discovering how it worked. Unk, meanwhile, had grasped the practical implications of Mech's demonstration and was enthusiastically nodding while pointing at the berries, making it clear that regardless of the linguistic complexities involved, he was entirely in favor of any communication system that resulted in food distribution. The fire settled into its evening rhythm, burning with the steady contentment of flames that had no appointments to keep and no deadlines to meet. The concept of sentence structure unleashed what could only be described as linguistic chaos. Once the group realized that sounds could be combined in various orders, they began experimenting with enthusiasm that far exceeded their competence. The result was a cacophony that sounded like several different species attempting to hold a debate while suffering from varying degrees of laryngitis. Throck, still nursing wounded pride from the saber-toothed tiger incident, decided to demonstrate his mastery of this new complex communication by attempting to convey the message. Tomorrow we hunt mammoth near the big rocks by the water. This ambitious linguistic construction emerged from his vocal cords as a series of sounds that resembled someone trying to describe a complicated recipe while simultaneously stubbing their toe. The message that actually reached his audience was closer to, "Rock, water big tomorrow, hunt we mammoth near," which created the unfortunate impression that they were planning to hunt a particularly large rock that lived near water and went by the name of mammoth. The confusion this generated led to a spirited discussion about the hunting properties of rocks, during which Bog helpfully demonstrated his technique for approaching suspicious boulders. This involved a great deal of cautious circling and stone throwing, performed with the sort of intense concentration typically reserved for diffusing explosives. The performance was both entirely unnecessary and oddly hypnotic, like watching someone very carefully paint a fence that didn't need painting. The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky above, distant points of light that had been conducting their own cosmic conversations for billions of years without requiring a single clarifying meeting or follow-up session. Their ancient light filtered down through the atmosphere with the patience of photons that had traveled unimaginable distances just to illuminate this small circle of early humans who were discovering that communication was significantly more complicated than it appeared. Lek, observing the grammatical pandemonium she had inadvertently unleashed, attempted damage control by introducing the concept of word order. She carefully demonstrated that "unk eat berries" conveyed a different meaning than "berries eat unk," though this distinction was somewhat lost on the group until Bog pointed out that the second version sounded like the berries had developed predatory tendencies, which was both unlikely and deeply concerning. This revelation led to what linguists would later term the Great Word Order Debate of 98,743 BCEE, though it was conducted entirely through increasingly elaborate demonstrations rather than actual debate. Each group member developed their own preferred system of word arrangement, leading to a communication protocol that resembled a verbal game of Twister played by people who had never heard the rules explained. The evening air carried the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus, a sophisticated acoustic communication system that had been refined over millions of years and never once required a status meeting or quarterly review. Their rhythmic chirping provided a soothing backdrop to the human linguistic experiments, like a natural white noise machine programmed by evolution itself. Grok, meanwhile, had become fascinated by the discovery that the same word could mean different things depending on how it was said. His experiments with vocal inflection turned the simple word for water into an entire emotional spectrum, ranging from water, available and refreshing, to water, slightly brackish but acceptable, to water, might possibly be contaminated with something unmentionable. This breakthrough in tonal communication was revolutionary, though it did result in some unfortunate incidents when group members misinterpreted routine requests for hydration as warnings about potential water poisoning. The fire had settled into a gentle glow, its flames dancing with the hypnotic rhythm of something that had perfected the art of simply being. The light it cast created a warm circle that pushed back against the gathering darkness, illuminating faces that were beginning to show the first glimmers of what would someday become the complex neural pathways associated with language processing. For now, though, those pathways resembled a subway system designed by someone who had never seen a map and wasn't entirely clear on the concept of destinations. Unk, having finally secured his share of the berries through a combination of persistent pointing and pathetic facial expressions, attempted to contribute to the linguistic development by introducing the concept of temporal markers. He pointed at the sun's position and made a sound that was supposed to indicate yesterday, though it came out sounding more like someone questioning the structural integrity of a nearby tree. This led to another extended clarification session, during which the group attempted to establish a basic vocabulary for describing time periods. The process was complicated by the fact that early humans had a somewhat flexible relationship with temporal precision. Yesterday could mean anything from earlier today to sometime last season, and tomorrow was often used to describe events that might occur at any point in the foreseeable future, including after the next ice age. This casual approach to chronology would have made scheduling conflicts impossible if anyone had been sophisticated enough to have conflicting schedules. Meg proposed using hand gestures to supplement their vocal communication, demonstrating a system of signs that could clarify meaning when words proved insufficient. This innovation was met with great enthusiasm, though it resulted in conversations that resembled a combination of sign language and competitive arm wrestling. The gestures themselves were intuitive enough, but when combined with the existing vocal confusion, they created a communication system that required participants to be simultaneously linguists, interpreters, and athletic enough to maintain complex arm positions for extended periods. The introduction of supplementary hand gestures transformed their communication circle into what resembled a very slow-motion aerobics class conducted by people who had forgotten the choreography halfway through. Arms waved with the deliberate precision of semaphore operators who had never been properly trained in semaphore, creating a visual symphony of confusion that was somehow both mesmerizing and deeply inefficient. Bog, who had finally managed to extricate himself from his custom-molded mud seat, attempted to demonstrate the gesture for far away by extending his arm toward the horizon. Unfortunately, this movement was interpreted by Throck as either an invitation to engage in some sort of ritualistic combat or possibly a warning about something approaching from that direction. The resulting defensive posture led to a chain reaction of confused gesturing that looked like a group of people trying to conduct an invisible orchestra while simultaneously swatting at equally invisible insects. The night air settled around them with the soft weight of darkness that had been practicing this routine since the invention of planetary rotation. The temperature dropped with the gradual inevitability of physics, encouraging the group to move closer to their fire, which continued its patient burning with the steadfast reliability of combustion that had never heard of planned obsolescence. Overhead, the first bats began their evening hunt, navigating through the darkness with an echolocation system so sophisticated it made human communication attempts look like children playing telephone with cups and string made of wet paper. Their high-pitched calls created a natural soundtrack that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, a stark contrast to the linguistic experiment unfolding below, which seemed to be moving in the opposite direction of efficiency. Lek, observing the gestural chaos she had inadvertently created, attempted to establish some basic rules for hand movements. She proposed that upward gestures should indicate positive concepts, while downward movements suggested negative ones. This system worked reasonably well until Erg pointed out that some concepts didn't fit neatly into positive or negative categories, such as sideways, or sort of reddish, or that thing that Bog does with his nose when he's thinking. This observation led to the development of what anthropologists would later recognize as humanity's first attempt at categorical thinking, though it was conducted with all the systematic rigor of people organizing a closet while blindfolded. The group spent considerable time debating whether muddy was inherently negative or simply a neutral state of being, a philosophical discussion that revealed the surprising depth of early human thought while simultaneously demonstrating their remarkable capacity for overthinking simple concepts. Grok, meanwhile, had discovered that different combinations of vocal sounds and hand gestures could create what he clearly considered to be nuanced meanings. His demonstration of small angry animal involved a series of squeaking noises accompanied by rapid claw-like hand movements that were so convincing that several group members instinctively looked around for the creature he appeared to be describing. When they realized this was purely theoretical communication, They regarded grok with the sort of respectful wariness typically reserved for shamans or people who claim to see invisible spirits. The fire crackled with renewed vigor as someone, probably Mech, who had appointed herself the group's unofficial fire maintenance specialist, added fresh wood to the flames. The new fuel caught with the enthusiastic combustion of organic matter that was finally fulfilling its destiny, sending up sparks that danced briefly against the night sky before winking out like tiny stars that had decided immortality was overrated. Throck, inspired by Grok's success with compound concepts, attempted to communicate the complex idea of hunting large animals while avoiding getting eaten by them. This required a performance that combined elements of stalking, throwing, running, and what appeared to be playing dead, all while maintaining a running commentary of grunts and whistles that sounded like a one-person recreation of an entire wildlife documentary. The interpretation of this elaborate communication proved challenging as different group members focused on different aspects of the performance. Unk became convinced they were planning a dramatic reenactment of last week's saber-toothed tiger encounter, while Bog thought Throck was proposing a new form of recreational dance that involved a lot of throwing motions and falling down. Meg, demonstrating the sort of practical intelligence that would eventually lead to civilization, suggested that they focus on developing a basic vocabulary for essential survival concepts before attempting to create interpretive performances about complex hunting strategies. This proposal was met with the sort of enthusiastic agreement typically reserved for suggestions that everyone take a nap or share food, indicating that even early humans possessed an intuitive understanding of the importance of establishing foundations before building elaborate superstructures. The stream that ran nearby continued its ancient conversation with the stones, providing a constant murmur that spoke of water's patient persistence in gradually reshaping the world through sheer consistency. The sound created a natural rhythm that was both soothing and hypnotic, like listening to the planet itself breathing slowly and deeply. Lek began the systematic process of establishing core vocabulary by pointing at essential items and carefully articulating what she considered to be the most logical sounds to represent them. Food, water, fire, shelter, danger, sleep. Each word was repeated multiple times by each group member, creating a chanting session that resembled a very primitive language learning course conducted around a campfire by people who were simultaneously the teachers and the only students. The vocabulary establishment process proceeded with all the urgency of continental drift. Each word required extensive debate about pronunciation, meaning, and whether it sounded sufficiently different from other words to avoid confusion. The word for food underwent 17 different iterations before the group settled on a sound that resembled someone clearing their throat while simultaneously expressing mild surprise, which had the advantage of being both distinctive and relatively easy to produce, even with a mouthful of berries. The darkness around them deepened with the patient inevitability of night, bringing with it the soft symphony of nocturnal creatures who had mastered communication systems so efficient they made human language look like a particularly elaborate form of interpretive confusion. Owls called to each other across the valley with messages that conveyed complex territorial information, mating availability, and probably commentary on the strange sounds emerging from the human gathering below. Ung, who had been silently practicing the new vocabulary by whispering to himself, suddenly made a discovery that would revolutionize their entire approach to linguistic development. He realized that the same basic sounds could be modified with what linguists would later recognize as primitive morphological markers, essentially adding small sounds to the beginning or end of words to change their meaning. This breakthrough was demonstrated when Ung took the established word for water and added a slight hissing sound at the end, creating what he clearly intended to mean lots of water, or possibly water that moves quickly. The group received this innovation with the sort of stunned silence typically reserved for witnessing someone spontaneously develop the ability to fly, followed by a period of frantic experimentation as everyone attempted to modify existing words with various acoustic additions. The results were mixed. Bog's attempt to create big food by adding a deep rumbling sound to the food word resulted in something that sounded more like food that disagrees with you, or possibly food that is currently disagreeing with someone else. Throck's modification of the danger word created such an alarming sound that everyone instinctively looked around for threats, leading to a temporary suspension of linguistic experimentation while the group conducted a thorough perimeter check. A gentle night breeze stirred the grass around their feet, carrying with it the sweet fragrance of night-blooming flowers that had evolved their own sophisticated chemical communication system millions of years before humans had figured out how to reliably indicate the difference between hello and help me. The scent drifted through their gathering like nature's own aromatherapy session, promoting the sort of relaxed alertness that was perfect for absorbing new linguistic concepts at the speed of glacial advance. Mech, observing the morphological chaos that Ung's discovery had unleashed, proposed establishing some basic rules for word modification. She suggested that sounds added to the beginning of words should indicate size or intensity, while sounds added to the end should indicate quantity or duration. This system worked well in theory, though it required the group to remember not only what each base word meant, but also what each possible modification signified, creating a cognitive load that strained the limits of memory systems that were primarily designed for recalling which berries were poisonous and where the nearest safe cave was located. The fire settled into its late evening rhythm, burning with the steady contentment of combustion that had found its perfect balance between fuel consumption and heat production. The flames danced with the hypnotic regularity of something that had mastered the art of sustained performance, casting shifting shadows that played across faces, increasingly illuminated by the first flickerings of what would eventually become linguistic sophistication. Grok, meanwhile, had become fascinated by the discovery that word order could dramatically affect meaning, even when using the same basic vocabulary. His experiments with rearranging their newly established words created messages that range from perfectly sensible to completely bewildering to accidentally profound. Water-big food made perfect sense as a description of a substantial meal that included drinking. Big water food suggested either very large aquatic edibles or possibly food that had been somehow enhanced with water. Food water big, however, seemed to imply either that their food was making a statement about the relative size of their water supply, or that they had discovered cuisine with unexpectedly strong opinions about hydration. These linguistic experiments were periodically interrupted by practical concerns, such as Lek's observation that their fire was beginning to die down and would require additional fuel if they intended to continue their communication workshop into the night. This led to a collaborative wood-gathering expedition that demonstrated their newly acquired vocabulary in practical application as they called out to each other using their established words for wood, fire, and more, along with various gestural supplements that indicated direction and urgency. The wood-gathering process itself became an impromptu field test of their communication system's effectiveness under real-world conditions. It quickly became apparent that their vocabulary, while adequate for sitting in a circle and naming objects, required significant expansion to handle the complexities of coordinated group activities. The absence of words for concepts like over there, not that piece, bigger than that, and watch out for the thorny part led to a gathering expedition that took approximately 3 times longer than necessary and resulted in a pile of fuel that included several pieces of wood that were either too green to burn properly or too small to sustain combustion for more than a few minutes. The stream continued its patient murmur, providing a constant reminder that some forms of communication required no conscious effort and had been perfecting themselves since the beginning of liquid water's relationship with gravity. The sound created a natural meditation soundtrack that seemed designed to promote the sort of relaxed focus necessary for absorbing complex new concepts at the pace of evolutionary development. Upon returning to their fire circle with their somewhat questionable fuel collection, the group discovered that their brief separation had created an unexpected linguistic challenge. They had each been practicing the new vocabulary privately, leading to subtle but significant variations in pronunciation that threatened to undo hours of careful standardization work. Bog's version of the water word now included a slight whistle that made it sound like he was summoning a particularly musical bird, while Ung had somehow added a clicking component that suggested either advanced dental techniques or possibly the early stages of a communication system borrowed from insects. This pronunciation drift led to what could be generously termed the Great Standardization Crisis of 98,743 BCE, during which the group attempted to re-establish consistent vocal patterns for their carefully developed vocabulary. The process involved a great deal of careful listening, patient repetition, and the sort of concentrated attention to minute acoustic details that would have made modern linguists weep with professional envy if they had possessed the attention span to focus on such subtle distinctions for more than 5 consecutive minutes. The night deepened around them with the gentle persistence of darkness that had been practicing the same routine since the invention of planetary axial rotation. Stars emerged in increasing numbers, creating a celestial display that had been conducting its own form of visual communication across cosmic distances for billions of years, without requiring a single clarifying committee meeting or follow-up session. Their ancient light provided just enough illumination to see facial expressions, which proved crucial for the next phase of linguistic development. Throk, emboldened by the evening's progress, proposed expanding their communication system to include what modern semioticians would recognize as basic emotional indicators. He demonstrated this concept by combining their established vocabulary with facial expressions that were supposed to clarify the speaker's attitude toward whatever they were discussing. Water, accompanied by a smile, clearly meant good water, while water delivered with a grimace suggested water that might contain interesting new forms of microbial life. This innovation was received with the sort of enthusiastic approval typically reserved for discoveries that solved multiple problems simultaneously. However, the implementation proved more challenging than the theory, as it quickly became apparent that different group members had radically different ideas about which facial expressions conveyed which emotions. Meek's attempt to indicate delicious food resulted in an expression that suggested either gustatory bliss or acute digestive distress, leading to considerable confusion about whether she was recommending or warning against whatever she was discussing. The fire crackled with renewed energy as the fresh wood caught flame, sending up sparks that danced briefly against the night sky like tiny messengers carrying news of humanity's slow progress towards sophisticated communication to whatever cosmic audience might be interested in such developments. The warm light it cast created a circle of visibility that pushed back against the darkness, illuminating faces that were beginning to show the first signs of what neuroscientists would later recognize as the neural pathways associated with complex symbolic thinking. Lek, observing the facial expression chaos that Throck's innovation had created, suggested a more systematic approach to emotional communication. She proposed establishing a basic set of standardized expressions that would be consistently interpreted by all group members, essentially creating humanity's first attempt at regulated emotional vocabulary. This process required each group member to practice various facial configurations while the others observed and attempted to guess the intended meaning, resulting in a session that resembled a very primitive form of acting class conducted by people who had never seen actual acting. The standardization of emotional expressions proved to be surprisingly complex, as it revealed the extent to which individual group members had developed their own personal systems of nonverbal communication. Grok's smile, for example, was apparently so subtle that it required careful observation under optimal lighting conditions to distinguish from his neutral expression, while Bog's frown was so dramatic that it suggested either profound displeasure or possibly the onset of some sort of neurological condition. A light evening mist began to gather in the valley below, drifting between the trees with the patient persistence of water vapor that had been practicing the same condensation routine since the invention of atmospheric moisture cycles. The air grew slightly cooler and carried with it the scent of night-blooming plants that had evolved their own sophisticated chemical communication systems without requiring extensive committee oversight or standardization protocols. Meanwhile, had become fascinated by the discovery that combining their established words with standardized facial expressions could create what he clearly considered to be nuanced emotional statements. His attempt to communicate, "I am moderately pleased about the availability of water," involved a complex combination of the water word, a carefully calibrated smile, and a series of hand gestures that were supposed to indicate the precise degree of his satisfaction. The message that actually reached his audience was closer to "Water makes me confused but hopeful," which was both more philosophically interesting and considerably less useful for practical communication purposes. The group's attempts to decode Ung's emotional elaborations led to a spirited discussion about the relationship between precision and comprehensibility in communication systems. It quickly became apparent that while detailed emotional expression was theoretically desirable, It required a level of interpretive sophistication that strained the limits of their newly developed linguistic abilities. The challenge was similar to attempting to write poetry in a language that had just invented nouns and was still working on the concept of verbs. Mech proposed a compromise solution, establishing a basic emotional vocabulary that included only the most essential feelings necessary for survival and group coordination. The Compromise Emotional Vocabulary Initiative proceeded with the sort of methodical thoroughness that characterized all of their linguistic endeavors. Mech's proposed system included what she considered to be the 5 most crucial emotional states: pleased, displeased, worried, excited, and confused. This seemed like a manageable range until the group attempted to establish standardized expressions for each emotion, at which point they discovered that emotional communication was considerably more subjective than anyone had anticipated. The expression for pleased, for example, required 17 different attempts before they settled on something that didn't suggest either mild indigestion or the early stages of a respiratory infection. Worried proved even more challenging, as different group members apparently experienced concern in dramatically different ways. Throck's worried expression looked like someone concentrating intensely on a difficult mathematical problem, while Bog's version suggested either profound existential dread or possibly constipation. The night air carried the distant howl of a wolf pack conducting their own highly sophisticated communication session somewhere in the darkness beyond their fire's reach. The calls echoed across the valley with the sort of coordinated precision that made human linguistic attempts seem charmingly amateur by comparison. Each howl conveyed specific information about pack location, hunting status, and territorial boundaries, a level of communicative efficiency that would take humans approximately 40,000 years to match, and even then only with the assistance of electronic devices. Grok, observing the emotional standardization struggles, proposed what he clearly considered to be a revolutionary alternative, using vocal tone instead of facial expressions to convey emotional states. This suggestion was met with the sort of thoughtful silence typically reserved for ideas that were either brilliant or completely insane, and which required careful consideration to determine which category they fell into. The tonal emotion system proved to be surprisingly intuitive once the group grasped the basic concept. A rising tone indicated positive emotions, while falling tones suggested negative states, and flat tones conveyed neutrality or confusion. The system worked reasonably well for basic communication, though it did result in conversations that sounded like a group of people attempting to sing songs they had never heard while simultaneously conducting conversations about practical matters. Lek, ever the practical organizer, suggested combining their tonal system with their established vocabulary to create what modern linguists would recognize as the earliest known example of prosodic communication. She demonstrated this by saying the word food with various tonal patterns, creating messages that ranged from food, and I'm excited about it, to food, but it's probably going to disagree with me, to food, which exists but doesn't particularly interest me at the moment. The fire settled deeper into its evening routine, burning with the steady reliability of combustion that had mastered the art of sustained performance without requiring constant supervision or performance reviews. The flames provided not only light and warmth, but also a hypnotic focal point that seemed to enhance the group's ability to concentrate on their increasingly complex linguistic experiments. the prosodic food demonstration triggered what could only be described as a breakthrough moment in early human communication development. Ung realized that tonal variations could be applied to any word in their vocabulary, essentially doubling their communicative capacity without requiring them to memorize additional sounds. This discovery was so significant that it temporarily overwhelmed their cognitive processing systems, leading to several minutes of stunned silence while everyone contemplated the implications. The practical application of tonal communication, however, proved more challenging than the theoretical concept. Bog's attempt to express enthusiasm about water resulted in a sound that suggested either extreme vocal strain or possibly the early stages of some sort of respiratory emergency. Throck's effort to convey concern about potential danger created such an alarming noise that everyone instinctively prepared for immediate evacuation, leading to a brief but intense period of confusion when no actual threat materialized. A gentle night breeze stirred the leaves overhead, creating a natural rustling sound that spoke of wind's ancient expertise in moving through vegetation without requiring instruction manuals or training seminars. The sound provided a soothing counterpoint to the human vocal experiments, like a patient teacher demonstrating proper technique through example rather than explanation. Mech, recognizing the need for vocal training to support their tonal communication system, proposed what she clearly considered to be organized practice sessions. This led to the world's first known example of group vocal exercises conducted around a campfire by people who were essentially inventing the concept of voice training as they went along. The session involved a great deal of humming, tone-matching attempts, and what could generously be described as prehistoric harmony exercises. The vocal practice revealed the extent to which individual group members possessed different natural vocal ranges and capabilities. Grok's voice had a naturally resonant quality that made even simple words sound authoritative, while Ung's higher pitch was perfect for conveying excitement but somewhat less effective for communicating serious concerns. Bog's voice seemed designed primarily for expressing confusion, which was fortunate since confusion was his most frequently experienced emotional state. The stream continued its patient conversation with the stones, demonstrating the sort of consistent, purposeful communication that had been refined over geological time periods. The water's murmur created a natural rhythm that seemed designed to promote the relaxed alertness necessary for absorbing new concepts at the pace of evolutionary development, like a meditation soundtrack composed by physics itself. Throck, inspired by the evening's vocal discoveries, attempted to combine tonal communication with their previously established gesture system, creating what he apparently envisioned as a multimedia communication experience. This resulted in performances that resembled someone attempting to conduct an invisible orchestra while simultaneously providing running commentary on the music, all while expressing complex emotions about basic survival concepts. The interpretation of Throck's multimedia communication attempts proved challenging, as audience members had to simultaneously process vocal tones, hand gestures, facial expressions, and word content, creating a cognitive load that exceeded the processing capacity of minds that were still working on mastering the relationship between sounds and meanings. Lek, demonstrating the sort of practical wisdom that would eventually lead to the development of project management, suggested that perhaps they were attempting to innovate faster than their cognitive infrastructure could support. She proposed focusing on mastering one communication enhancement at a time before layering additional complexities onto their already strained linguistic foundation. This suggestion was received with the sort of grateful relief typically reserved for someone offering to carry heavy luggage up a very long flight of stairs. The group decided to concentrate on perfecting their tonal system before attempting to integrate additional communicative elements. This led to what could be charitably described as a prehistoric language laboratory session, during which each member practiced applying various tonal patterns to their established vocabulary, while the others listened with the sort of concentrated attention typically reserved for safety briefings or instructions for disarming potentially explosive devices. The night deepened around them with the patient inevitability of celestial mechanics, bringing with it a symphony of nocturnal sounds that demonstrated communication systems so refined they made human efforts look like children banging on pots and pans while claiming to be performing a symphony. Crickets maintained their steady rhythm. Owls called across territorial boundaries with precision that would have impressed military communications specialists, and somewhere in the distance, a pack of wild dogs conducted what sounded like a remarkably efficient staff meeting about hunting strategies. Grok's tonal experiments had evolved to include what could only be described as emotional subcategories. His rendition of water now included variations for water that I'm excited about, water that concerns me slightly, water that I'm neutral about but acknowledge the existence of, and water that reminds me of that time when Bog fell into the stream and made those interesting splashing sounds. The last category was arguably unnecessary for basic survival communication, but it demonstrated the sort of creative elaboration that would eventually lead to poetry, storytelling, and other forms of artistic expression that served no practical survival purpose but made life considerably more interesting. The fire had settled into its late-night configuration, burning with the steady contentment of combustion that had found its perfect rhythm between fuel consumption and heat production. The flames cast dancing shadows that played across faces increasingly animated by the excitement of linguistic discovery, creating a visual accompaniment to their vocal experiments that resembled a very primitive form of shadow theatre performed by people who were simultaneously the actors, audience, and script writers. Ung, meanwhile, had become fascinated by the discovery that tonal patterns could be applied not just to individual words, but to entire sequences of sounds, creating what modern musicologists would recognize as the earliest known example of human melodic communication. His attempts to tell the story of yesterday's berry-gathering expedition using a combination of established vocabulary and musical phrasing resulted in a performance that was equal parts practical information sharing and inadvertent artistic expression. The melodic storytelling concept proved to be both revolutionary and exhausting. While it certainly made communication more engaging and memorable, it also required speakers to possess not only linguistic competence, but also musical ability, effectively doubling the skill requirements for basic conversation. This led to what could be described as early humanity's first encounter with the tension between artistic enhancement and practical efficiency, a conflict that would continue to characterize human communication development for the next 100,000 years. Meek, observing the melodic complexity that Ung's innovation had introduced, proposed establishing what she clearly considered to be reasonable limits on artistic elaboration for basic survival communication. She suggested that musical storytelling be reserved for special occasions, while day-to-day communication should focus on clarity and efficiency rather than aesthetic enhancement. This proposal sparked what could generously be termed a philosophical debate about the relationship between utility and beauty in communication systems. The debate was conducted entirely through their newly developed tonal vocabulary, creating a discussion that resembled a very slow musical argument performed by people who were making up both the melody and the lyrics as they went along. The conversation covered surprisingly sophisticated concepts about the nature of communication, the role of aesthetic pleasure in human interaction, and whether berry-gathering stories required musical enhancement to be properly appreciated by their intended audience. A light mist began to rise from the valley floor, drifting through the trees with the patient persistence of water vapor that had been practicing the same condensation routine since the invention of atmospheric humidity. The air grew cooler and carried with it the scent of night-blooming flowers that had evolved complex chemical communication systems without requiring extensive philosophical debates about the aesthetic merits of their signaling methods. The resolution of the utility versus beauty debate came when Bog, whose contributions to theoretical discussions were usually limited but occasionally profound, pointed out that their communication system needed to work reliably when people were tired, stressed, or being chased by large predators. This practical observation effectively ended the artistic enhancement discussion, as everyone agreed that melodic storytelling was probably not the optimal communication method for emergency situations involving saber-toothed tigers or unexpected encounters with territorial mammoth herds. Throck, accepting the practical limitations on artistic communication, proposed what he considered to be a reasonable compromise, developing a basic emergency vocabulary that prioritized speed and clarity over aesthetic considerations, while reserving their more elaborate tonal and melodic systems for leisure communication during safe, relaxed periods like their current fireside gathering. This suggestion was met with the sort of enthusiastic agreement typically reserved for proposals that solved multiple problems simultaneously while requiring minimal additional work from anyone involved. The emergency vocabulary concept was both practical and achievable, and it had the additional advantage of providing a clear distinction between communication that needed to work under pressure and communication that could afford to be more experimental and artistic. The stream continued its ancient dialogue with the stones, providing a constant reminder that some forms of communication had achieved perfect efficiency through millions of years of refinement and required no conscious effort or theoretical debate to function effectively. The water's murmur created a natural soundtrack that seemed designed to promote the sort of relaxed focus necessary for absorbing complex new concepts at the pace of gradual understanding rather than hurried confusion. The group spent the remainder of their session establishing what they clearly considered to be essential emergency vocabulary. The emergency vocabulary development proceeded with characteristic thoroughness, covering essential concepts like run, hide, danger, help, and that thing behind you is definitely not supposed to be that close. Each word was carefully tested for clarity under simulated stress conditions, which involved speaking quickly while jumping up and down to approximate the vocal effects of running for one's life. The results were mixed, as it turned out that clear pronunciation was considerably more challenging when one's respiratory system was occupied with activities other than careful articulation. The testing process revealed that several of their carefully developed words became virtually indistinguishable when spoken under duress. The subtle tonal differences that had seemed so important during calm, seated discussion disappeared entirely when delivered by someone who was out of breath and possibly experiencing the early stages of panic. This led to the development of what could be called panic-proof vocabulary, words that remained recognizable even when shouted by someone who was simultaneously running and trying to remember which direction led to safety. The fire had burned down to a comfortable glow, its flames settling into the gentle rhythm of combustion that knew its work was nearly done for the evening. The warm light it cast created an increasingly intimate circle as the fuel was consumed, drawing the group closer together in a way that seemed to enhance both their sense of community and their ability to hear the subtle vocal distinctions they had been working so hard to establish. By the time the moon had reached its zenith, a celestial timekeeper that had been maintaining its schedule with astronomical precision since long before humans had developed the concept of being late for anything, the group had successfully established a basic communication system that included essential survival vocabulary, emergency protocols, and the theoretical framework for future artistic enhancement during periods of safety and leisure. The night sounds of the forest created a natural lullaby around their dying fire, a symphony of crickets, distant water, gentle wind through leaves, and the soft breathing of 7 early humans who had just participated in one of the most significant developments in the history of their species, though they were probably too tired to fully appreciate the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Lex suggested that they practice their new vocabulary once more before settling down for sleep, ensuring that the day's linguistic developments would be properly consolidated in their memories. This final review session was conducted in the drowsy, comfortable tones of people who had accomplished something meaningful and were ready to rest, their voices blending with the natural sounds of the night in a way that seemed to connect human communication with the larger conversation that the planet itself had been conducting since the beginning of time. One by one, the group members settled into their sleeping positions around the glowing embers, their breathing gradually synchronizing with the ancient rhythms of wind and water and flame. Their newly developed words and sounds would be tested and refined over the coming days, weeks, and generations, slowly evolving into something that distant descendants would recognize as the foundation of human language. The fire settled into its final phase, burning with the quiet satisfaction of combustion that had successfully completed another day's work in the long, slow process of human development. The last conscious thoughts of the evening were probably variations of their newly established vocabulary. Words for satisfaction, completion, rest, and the gentle anticipation of tomorrow's continued experiments in the elaborate, inefficient, absolutely essential art of learning to speak to each other. The forest settled into its nightly routine around them, conducting its own conversations in languages that had been perfected over millions of years, providing a peaceful soundtrack for dreams that would probably feature new words, better gestures, and perhaps, eventually, the revolutionary concept of actually finishing sentences before the listener fell asleep. And so ended another remarkably productive day in the glacially paced development of human civilization, marked by progress so gradual it was barely perceptible, yet so fundamental that it would echo through every conversation, every story, and every sleepy good night murmured by every human who would ever live, dream, and slowly, patiently learn to translate the contents of one mind into sounds that another mind could understand.